10-minute rule motion, Ben Lake.
Diolch, Mr Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to make provision for access by customers, in particular those in rural areas, to banking services, to make provision for community banking hubs, to review access to banking services through the post office network and for connected purposes. In an otherwise fraught and divided political climate, few issues unify members from both sides of the House and from every corner of the British Isles as successfully as that of bank closures. And in short, Mr Speaker, my bill would make it more difficult for banks to close branches, enable the establishment of community banking hubs, and ascertain whether the Post Office has the necessary resources to truly deliver its banking offer. The insidious decline of the bank branch network is a long-standing phenomenon. The number of branches has halved since 1988, with over 800 closing in 2017 and a further 250 earmarked for closure this year. In too many instances, banks are abandoning communities that have supported them for generations. This is certainly the case in Ceredigion, where bank after bank has decided to vacate. Ceredigion was home to some of the first banking networks at the turn of the 19th century. The 21st, however, has seen the seaside towns of Aberaeron and New Quay lose branches, and the old market towns of Llandysul and Tregaron inheriting the unenviable accreditation of being towns without any banks at all. The most recent round of closures include those in the towns of Cardigan and Lampeter. There is no solace to be found in the tragic irony that these rural communities, home to some of the earliest banking networks, could soon be deprived of any at all. Mr Speaker, this is an experience replicated across the UK, and the concerns arising from it do not in any way reflect a romantic fixation with the past or a Luddite reluctance to acknowledge that the way in which we bank is changing. Rather, the transformation in both personal and business banking is developing in such a way as to leave some communities behind. Yes, the use of cash may well have fallen by a fifth in the past decade, and I do not doubt that the number of branch visits has fallen by a third since 2011. But neither should we turn a blind eye to the fact that for many individuals and businesses, particularly those in rural or deprived areas, accessing banking facilities over the counter is still crucial. Losing this point of access has a devastating impact on the local community, and too often online banking is still a hope for the future rather than a realistic alternative for the present. Indeed, it is often the case that those areas that have suffered branch closures also receive among the poorest broadband services, such as Ceredigion, where almost half of all properties do not have decent broadband by Ofcom standards. Without access to physical branches, therefore, and in the absence of sufficient broadband, people are simply unable to conduct their day-to-day banking online, let alone change their accounts, no matter how seamless or intuitive banks make their websites. Compounding this lack of digital connectivity is the fact that public transport links are often poorer in rural areas, making that 20 or 30-mile journey to the nearest branch even more challenging, especially for the elderly, those with disabilities and those on low incomes. The impact of branch closures on small businesses and the local economy is also significant. As the Association of Convenience Stores has noted, 73% of rural customers still pay by cash. Apart from the practical difficulties that branch closures cause for the operations of small businesses, a 2016 report by Move Your Money found that they also have a severe impact on local business finance. Bank branch closures dampen SME lending growth by an average of 63%, and postcodes that have lost the last bank in town lose almost £1.6 million worth of lending over the course of a year. The present trend of branch closures has a devastating impact on individuals, businesses and communities, which this bill seeks to mitigate. In all fairness, Mr Speaker, some banks are beginning to improve the way in which they support communities following an announcement of a branch closure. This is partly a result of the Access to Banking Protocol and its more recent reinforced iteration, the Access to Banking Standard. Although some banks will adhere to or even go beyond the requirements detailed in the standard, it needs to be strengthened further if it is to stem the tide of closures. My bill would therefore build on the current Access to Banking Standard and place it on a statutory footing so that customers of every bank can be assured of best practice. At present, communities understandably feel disconnected from the development of local networks. Therefore, prior to a decision to close a branch, this bill would require banks to work more closely with the local community as part of their pre-closure assessments and determine what options, other than complete closure, are possible. This would have to include proper consultation with communities so that the full impact of a closure is clear and that alternative options are identified before a final decision is made. Greater emphasis would also be placed on where customers will be able to access cash in rural areas, such as proximity to a post office, another bank branch or cash machine, and this distance would be measured in travel time rather than geographical distance. Furthermore, local transport, in addition to broadband infrastructure, would be considered as part of this process, where the provision is so poor as to exclude customers from being able to access an equivalent service. Banks would need to work with others to improve the situation, and if necessary, funds should be made available for broadband schemes and skills training. Finally, consideration would also be given to the wider impact that a closure has on a community, including the fact that a branch is often not only the last bank in town, but also the last service in town. In such circumstances, a bank should be precluded from closing the branch unless an equivalent alternative can be secured, or pay a levy to fund the provision of community banking. In order to provide banks and communities a greater range of options other than closure, this bill would also make provision for the establishment of community banking hubs. In essence, such an option would enable banks to pool their resources to provide centres in which they could all be accessed by their customers. In other words, Mr. Speaker, this bill would help banks to co-locate rather than completely vacate our rural communities. While there is no specific regulation preventing banks from sharing branches, such banking hubs would require significant cooperation and a fair amount of trust if their practical and commercial challenges are overcome. In order to address these challenges and to inspire collaboration between banks, this bill would encourage the creation of regional forums that would open an avenue for banks to discuss ways in which they can work together in order to maintain a physical presence in communities. The role of the post office, and in particular its banking offer, has been referred to in many of the recent debates about community banking. The services available through its network are certainly vast, and in many instances they have served to fill the gap left by the closure of the last bank in town. If post offices are to assume this ever-growing responsibility, it stands to reason that resources will be required to ensure that staff are trained in banking services or that they employ those who are made redundant by bank closures. Furthermore, many post offices require physical adjustments to make them appropriate centres for greater banking services, from improving accessibility to the installation of private meeting rooms to discuss personal finance matters. Funds should be forthcoming from either central government or the vacating banks to support this. For if the government does intend for the post office to assume the vacuum left by retail banks, they must stand ready to allocate the resources needed for it to truly flourish in this new role. And before doing so, a review is required to ascertain what precisely is needed in this regard. This bill would provide for such a review. Taken together, the aspects of this bill would stem the tide of branch closures. It will ensure that banks give full consideration of the broader impact that closure has on communities, offer an alternative way for banks to maintain their physical presence in rural areas, and determine what support will be needed if the post office is to assume an even greater role. As Professor Griggs noted in his review of the Access to Banking Protocol, we should not wait for branches to close before addressing the issues that some have with these changes, but rather banks and the public sector should work proactively to find alternatives to help all of us feel that we are part of this journey and not excluded from it. Madam Deputy Speaker, I would be glad to have the opportunity to consider other aspects of this issue should the House give me leave to bring in the bill, which I commend to this House. Yeah.